President Trump and Vladimir Putin are meeting behind closed doors in Helsinki, Finland. The two leaders addressed reporters earlier today and are expected to hold a joint news conference after their talks.
For more, let's turn to CBS News Chief White House correspondent Major Garrett. He joins us now from Helsinki. So, Major, put this meeting in context for us. What is at stake? And I think it's hard to figure out exactly what's at stake because we don't know what's on the president's agenda, really.
Right. We don't know what's at stake. We don't know what to expect on the other side of these two meetings. First, the one-on-one meeting between President Trump and President Putin, then the extended meeting where lots of advisors, Russian and American, will be in the room to try to hash out whatever may have been set in motion in that private meeting. President Trump, for whatever reason, has been completely vague about his own intentions going into this summit. What issues does he care to drive with the Russian president? What interests of the United States is he going to bring to bear up against the Russian leader? And what is he going to try to extract in terms of concessions from the Russians? Or to get them simply to live up to agreements they've already made with this president in places, for example, like Syria. We don't know what the president wants out of this meeting. That's one of the reasons, until yesterday when the president declared this a summit on Twitter, all of his senior advisors, publicly and privately, were saying to reporters like me, don't you dare call this a summit. It's a meeting. A summit's got too big of an agenda, sets too high of expectations. Then what does President Trump call it on Twitter? He calls it a summit. Well, that suggests a couple of things. One, a decoupling from his own advisors about how to set expectations for this encounter. And two, it suggests that even when those closest to the president are trying to help him by maintaining a lower level of expectations, the president either doesn't take that help seriously or defies it for his own reason. And I can tell you, when I was in Brussels talking to NATO ministers and talking to those back in the United States in preparation for covering this summit, each and every moment in this extended period of time that President Trump spends one-on-one with Vladimir Putin raises the level of anxiety in European capitals and back home. Why? Because in this statecraft, Putin is a much more experienced negotiator, knows what his agenda is, drives his bargain his way, capable of flattering not just this president but other American presidents and getting his way more often than not. So that's a construct that creates some degree of anxiety among American allies. What may or may not happen in this private encounter, and what will Vladimir Putin say on the other side of it in terms of issues he's tried to drive with the American president. By entering with a vague agenda, it creates an opening, at least an opening, for Putin to get more of what he wants because he will have defined it up front.
And Major, what is the White House saying about that vague agenda when for a lot of Americans, a lot of members of Congress, there could be a couple of specific things the president could say he wants to talk about. He could say he wants to talk about Crimea. He could say he wants to talk about the poisoning of UK citizens on their soil. He can say that he wants to talk about those 12 Russian intelligence officials that were just indicted by the Department of Justice. But yet he left it to, we're going to talk about China, we're going to talk about nuclear, we want to have a good relationship. How is the White House responding to that line of thinking from other Americans?
That the president sets the agenda, and that's it. And he's the deal maker, and he's the chief negotiator, and what he says goes. That goes back to this decoupling I talked about whether to describe this as a summit or a meeting. All these people on behalf of the president were working overtime to say it's just a meeting, lowering expectations. Boom, the president calls a summit. That means he's running the show. He's at the top, and he defines his own reality and defines whatever the contours of what he wants to negotiate in the moment at that time. Then he leaves it to his advisors to try to sort out and cope with the consequences. Let's remind ourselves how that played out in Singapore with the summit with Kim Jong-un. Trust me, no one in the administration expected the president to, at that meeting, give up joint military exercises with the South Korean government. And yet the president did. And when he announced it, it surprised the South Koreans, it surprised the Pentagon, it surprised our Japanese allies. And yet that's what's happened. The president made a deal in the moment, face-to-face, one-on-one with Kim Jong-un. And then everyone else had to adapt to it afterwards. And in so announcing the end of those joint military exercises, President Trump used the very language the North Korean regime had always used. They were provocative. So that's an example, a classic, there for everyone to see example of what can happen in these one-on-one meetings where the president walks in, those around him don't know what his agenda is, don't know what he's going to agree to. He agrees to it, turns around to everyone else and says, make it work. So there is some, I guess, anticipation here in Helsinki. What is President Trump going to turn around and say to his advisors after this lengthy meeting with Putin and say, that's what I've agreed to, make it work? But to your point, Vlad, he's given no indication that he is passionately or even intellectually or politically motivated to drive this issue of Russian meddling in the election hard, past or present. And his administration has been somewhat ambiguous about what to say about Russian incursion in Crimea. They haven't said they will recognize it officially, but they haven't ruled it out. That's an opening for the Russians. And I can tell you in Brussels, another big topic, it's not a huge issue, but it's one that's central to the future of the NATO alliance, joint military exercises in the Baltics. Vladimir Putin would like those to end. NATO member nations want them to continue as a signal to Moscow, don't mess around in the Baltics. So you got to keep an eye on that as well.
You brought up the Russian meddling, and of course this is coming after we found out on Friday that 12 Russian officers were charged with hacking into the DNC. I think my question to you, Major, is, the president has said that he might bring it up. It's not really sort of top of his agenda. But what can he really say? What are his options? President Obama famously told Vladimir Putin to cut it out. Didn't really make much of a difference.
So when it comes to options, you can use the voice of America, the presidency of the United States, and as the essentially repository at the top of the American democracy to say, you know what, we in America care about our democracy and we're going to protect it, and you invaded it in a hostile act, and we know it. The indictments are real. The facts are there. This happened at the highest levels of your government. We know it. You should know that we know it, and we will take every single step we can to stop it in the future. Now, that's not a controversial thing to say. It's a direct, forceful response to a hostile act by a hostile government. Many in Congress have asked for the president to say precisely those words and say them in public and reinforce them in private. And one of the things the American government can do, which it is slow to have done under the Trump administration, is fortify cyber defenses, gather all the states of various election offices, Secretary of State and the like, and help them fortify their defenses and make it a project to monitor and intercept and call out publicly any future efforts by the Russians. All of those are options available to President Trump. And many in Congress, in both parties, are at least hopeful he will move in that direction.
I just want to point out Major's discipline and control and focus, because we can hear there's another correspondent very close to you talking very loud, and you stayed focused on us.
Yeah, we appreciate that as always, Major. And Major, we should just point out for our audience, with regards to how President Trump is treating this meeting and treating the Russians. He tweeted earlier, as you know, Major, our relationship with Russia has never been worse thanks to many years of U.S. foolishness and stupidity, and now the rigged witch hunt. The Russian Foreign Ministry of Affairs, through their Twitter account, responded, "We agree." So that's where we are right now.
That's remarkable. It's just remarkable to think of that. And that is part of President Trump's sense of himself and sense of his presidency as being so different than any presidency that came before it. On this and so many other issues, it's as if the American presidency didn't exist before he arrived there. Or if it did, it was so misdirected and so foolish, so stupid, that it's the cause of all current problems he's trying to sort out. Well, nothing could please the Russians more than to have the President of the United States, as he walks into a private meeting with Putin, essentially embrace their interpretation. Hey, it's not us. It's not us invading Ukraine and taking over Crimea. It's not us breaking agreements we've made with you in Syria. It's not us meddling in your elections, past and possibly present. It's not us, as you mentioned, Vlad, poisoning a British citizen in Britain. None of those things have harmed the U.S. relationship. It's those past American presidents. For that, Vladimir Putin would almost, I think, want to extend to President Trump a metaphorical and literal bouquet of thanks, because it couldn't set a better predicate for their conversation, because it's more than halfway to what the Russians already believe about themselves and about this relationship. It's pretty amazing.
Indeed. Major Garrett in Helsinki for us. Major, thank you very much.
You got it.